Trans identities in Hollywood. How has representation of trans identities changed over time, and what does it mean? Okay, so before I can even go into anything, we have to give a lot of context to some words we would be using. Trans identities, that just refers to any sort of identity under the trans umbrella, whether it be transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming. Hollywood movies, this isn't literally referred to Hollywood movies, it just refers to movies that they're centered in the US and have a popular impact in the US and to pop culture in general. And the general public. This is this unspecific majority of people, so we're not looking at demographics, we're not looking at any sort of category of people, we're just going off based off, assuming that they're in the US, that they just are the public. We don't really care about their demographics. Okay, so specifically, what are we looking at? Representation of trans identities and minorities. This is going to be looking at how it's changed and how it's improved and kind of or we're trying to find out whether it improved or unimproved. We're looking at this. We're looking at this historically. We're gonna go back a few years and look at a few movies that are more in the past, and we're gonna try to extract the general public's perception of this representation. So how did we get here? I knew automatically that I wanted to do something in the film industry because I would like to follow that in the future. So I knew that was definitely a place I wanted to go on when doing my research. I wanted to make it LGBTQ focused because I thought it's like a very important research field, especially in my current like academic level. Like it's not something that's very like talked about, and so I think it would be really important. And it was more interesting to look into it that way, and I wanted something that had some sort of influence. So any sort of media, and I decided to pick movies. So why representation of trans identities? So trans identities in general are underrepresented. For some people, the media they consume might be the only way they view and see these people, and that's something that's very important when it comes to how people perceive other people. Representation is not just only important to the minorities that it's representing, but also the majorities that are seeing these minorities being represented. So what is the goal we're looking for? We're trying to find a trend in the stuff that we're going to see, and we're trying to see if we can reconsider how we as I guess the Hollywood industry, the movie industry, how they represent minorities and any sort of minority, and we're trying to understand how representation has changed over time. So what did I learn in my findings? What did I find? So one big thing is the types of representation. There was plenty of types that I found kind of like scattered about, but the most important ones that we're using are intentional representation, which is the intentional use of characters or elements in order to represent a minority or character, and proxy representation, which is the unintentional use of elements or the subtext that can still read and come off as representing a certain group. Another thing is that negative representation is harmful. There's also vilification and exploitation of minorities in movies. This is actually done historically because of previous codes and assessments, and this serves as a formula representation today and what we kind of look at and how we represent today. We also found that representation is actually best when it's made by the minority. This is because it's removed from a context that is not of its own. So when you're looking at trans identities in general, when you remove it from a stereotypical cisgender context, you can get better representation that way. So what am I doing exactly? I'm going to be looking at popular Hollywood movies, and I'm going to be looking at these reviews about these, and I'm going to be sorting these reviews as positive or negative. We're going to analyze the data that we're given, and we're going to decide what we can find out of it, right? So how am I going to do this? This is, I think, this is what I'm going to call a qualitative quantitative meta-analysis. So while the reviews that we're looking at are qualitative, we're going to quantify them in the data and the numbers and the percentages, and we're going to be generalizing representation as a whole for that given movie or I guess era, year. So my method specifically is that we're selecting movies that have trans identities represented in them. We're sorting these movies as positive or negative, and we're comparing these numbers to the other films that are going to be present that we're also looking. So we're going to be comparing all the films that we find in total, and we're going to be doing this through a word of mouth site known as Rotten Tomatoes. So Rotten Tomatoes is a user-centric site. It's a reviewing site for movies, and it's basically a way for people to communicate online and share opinions and perceptions of movies like together. And this is important because word of mouth sites are actually very important to movies' growth, as I found in some other findings. So I'm not necessarily defining these terms, but I'm definitely objectifying how I'm going to be using these subjective terms that would usually have a lot of vagueness to them. So for example, when we're referring to positive movies, we're referring to stuff that has a beneficial or accurate representation, or when it's a negative, it's going to be something that something that is claiming that a movie has exploitative or villainizing representation. If it's inconclusive, it's just unclear, but it's very opinionated and very hard to tell. And if it's unrelated or inaccessible, it's some sort of data that I couldn't get behind if it weren't because of a paywall or because of some out-of-date website. And obviously, if the reviewer goes out of its way to specifically use the word, or specifically say that something is an example of positive or negative representation, that's a great indicator of what I'm going to be, what category it's going to fall under. So here is the kind of graph setup I used visualized. As you can see here, we're going to be sorting the movie by its positive reviews, negative reviews, inclusive reviews, and its unrelated and inaccessible reviews. And the final percentages that we end up getting, we're not going to consider the unrelated reviews because we're not necessarily interested in those at that point. We're just looking at the reviews that have to do with representation. So which movies did I choose? I only chose movies with Academy Awards or nominations that have popular directors or actors and are at feature length. This is so it's actually relevant and actually has some sort of effect on pop culture, while there's lots of really good smaller movies that are probably a really good example of representation or showing good change of representation. They're just not relevant enough to the general public to be considered in the study. All right, so the first one that I ended up choosing in chronological order is Silence of the Lambs. So this was actually an Academy Award movie, but the thing that made it really special is that it's actually it's a transcoded movie and it's a proxy representation. So despite it's not explicitly containing a trans character, if you look into it, people will know this movie as one with the trans serial killer. And so it's an example of how proxy representation can really take over the intention of a character, and because of its character's trans elements, it's a really, well, in my opinion, it's a really bad example of trans representation and how it can be misinterpreted with representation in mind. Alright, the next movie we're doing is Boys Don't Cry. It's another Academy Award movie. It's a trans story played by a cis actress, and another big thing about this one is that it's actually it's based off of true stories, so therefore I guess there's a lot of subjectivity when it comes to like how things are displayed and where things are considered exploitative and representative, and that's why it was really interesting to look into this one. Another one was Tangerine. It has a famous director, Sean Baker, and it's a trans story played by a trans actress, and it has a trans character. Another really important thing about this one is that it's actually about sex workers, which is a very usually negative, something that's portrayed in negative light, but this movie goes ahead and kind of tries to make a center story about it, which I think was really important. And finally was Assassination Nation, which is also by another famous director, Sam Levinson, and it contains a trans character and a trans actress, but a non-transcentric story. I also found this one really important because it's the most recent, it's not the most recent trans movie, but it's the most recent one that I think had some sort of impact on pop culture, and it honestly was just a great way to kind of cap up that, because as much as I would like to do a movie maybe that came out this year or last year, I just found that like 2018 was a good stopping point. So the data I got, here are the numbers. Most of the stuff that is shown isn't really important except for what's highlighted. We can see that in the older films, negative representation is more prevalent, and in the newer films, positive representation is more prevalent. And this shows that, at a glance, this shows that there's the general public's perception of positive representation is actually increasing over time. And this also shows us that trans stories are capable of having bad representation. And so what we're seeing here is just that these newer movies have generally a more positive representation. So what generalizations can we make out of this? We can say that there is a positive trend representation that's clearly visible, as shown by the numbers that we looked at. That the subject matter of a movie does not matter, and that actually a movie can be completely a non-transcentric story and still contain a positive character, and that's something that isn't necessarily, I guess we wouldn't necessarily expect, because it's unrelated to, it just contains a trans character. But another thing is that people actually do identify and categorize representation on their own. Like, this is a thing that people actively do. In this quote, the most important part that I found here is the bottom here, where it says, Assassination Nation's success, giving audiences a wonderful representation of a trans character whose arc has little to do with her identity. This is an example of a review that specifically quotes the representation present, and so that's something I really didn't expect to find too often. I didn't expect to find lots of reviews that specifically addressed the representation and specifically gave it a category as positive or negative, but this just shows that this does matter to people in the movie reviewing community, even if it's not necessarily something that has some academic basis as of now. And so what implications does this have? I think that honestly this just shows that people do think about representation. Like, this is a thing that people kind of do digest, and while reviewers are only a small minority of people that view a movie, this is definitely something that is going on in people's heads. That movie makers are actually kind of responsible for representation because the way they portray a character is being perceived by the audience, and so therefore they kind of have some sort of responsibility that comes with I guess the power of portraying a character, and that perception of representation affects the perception of a minority. That no matter what, as long as a minority is perceived on a film, it is going to affect how this minority is perceived outside in the real world. So what limitations did this study have? The biggest limitation, honestly, is that demographics were ignored. While I did specifically and intentionally choose to ignore these demographics, I think there was a lot of there's a lot of context that could give that can help me pick a lot or make a lot more major claims and make a lot more have more basis to work around and kind of give me more of a conclusion to work with. I did end up picking a small pick of films. Honestly, if it wasn't such a lengthy research project, I definitely would have liked to research process. I would have definitely liked to kind of explore more films in between. I feel like there's a big jump in between the 1999 and I think 2015, which is just a good amount of a good decade that's kind of ignored. But there was no necessarily movies that I want to look at that qualified under the Hollywood movie definition that I made. And honestly, that there's just not enough data to make major claims. This is, in my original question, I did say that I wanted to show what this representation, what it would mean, and what this change of representation means, but honestly, I don't think I have enough data with the current research method I do in order to make any major claims. And so, what can we conclude out of this? We conclude that representation does matter, and it is something that's important and considered in people's lives. Representation of trans identities in general has changed positively over time, and that this outdated, harmful formula for representation of minorities is slowly getting undone in order to kind of pave way for more positive representation for people in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so how did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
So as I said in my method, I specifically did use any unrelated unrelated reviews, because lots of reviews, even though there were movies specifically about trans characters and trans identities, also did not address the representation in itself. And I knew that even though they have something positive to say about the film or they have something negative to say about the film, they're not addressing the representation itself. I figured that it's because of its unrelated nature, it honestly wasn't going to be important to the final percentages that I got because they're not addressing the representation itself.
How did the limitations of your method or data influence your new understandings?
Also, as I said in my presentation, I did want to kind of find what the data that I got, what it would mean. And while that's very vague, I feel like I didn't get a lot of what I was trying to look for. I feel like a lot of the lack, because of reviews being found online and just the very limited graph that I used where I just kind of categorize them as positive, negative, or inconclusive, I feel like that there was a lot of data that I guess that was missing that was more subjective that I could have looked into that could have given me more to my conclusion.
And think back to the initial curiosity that sparked your inquiry. What other curiosities do you have, and how has this process prepared you to explore them?
One big thing, honestly, is that I kind of wanted to look into the horror genre in general. I feel like there was a lot of very interesting kind of subtle I don't want to say representation, but there's subtle I guess there's subtle perceptions in horror movies, and there was a whole different world of minorities presented in horror movies, and I definitely wanted to look into that more in the very beginning. But I kind of had to lean away just because there wasn't enough to work with, and I didn't know how to necessarily combine the two. I didn't want to abandon one project and go to the other, so I really did find that in the beginning I did want to